You useless woman, do you think you're the homeowner?
The electric hair clipper buzzed with a cold, harsh sound in the silent dining room. Ngozi grabbed Mama Kemi's silver hair and slammed her head down onto the wooden table. "You think you still have the right to tell me how to live in this house?" she hissed. In the next second, the blade of the clipper ran through the old woman's hair. Strands of silver fell onto the table, then slowly drifted down to the floor. Mama Kemi did not fight back. Her frail hands trembled as they clutched the edge of the table, as if trying to hold on to the last pieces of her dignity. Her eyes slowly closed, not because of pain, but because of the humiliation of a mother being treated with cruelty inside her own son's home. Ngozi let out a cold laugh. "Now you finally look like what you really are, a useless old woman." But what she didn't know was that a brand new security camera had been installed on the living room ceiling earlier that morning. Quietly, silently, it was recording everything. Every word, every action, and every stroke of the clipper cutting through Mama Kemi's silver hair. In just a few hours, that footage would leave the entire family speechless when the truth was revealed. This story is not only about the cruelty of a daughter-in-law, it also reminds us of a powerful lesson. A family may be extremely wealthy, but without respect for parents, everything becomes meaningless. If you believe parents deserve love and protection, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss meaningful stories like this. And tell us in the comments, which country are you watching this story from? Now listen to the story until the very end. Because when the husband returns home and watches the security footage, what happens next will shock everyone in that mansion. Ngozi always told people that all she wanted was a peaceful home. She said it with the gentle tone of a woman who knew exactly which face to wear for the right crowd, the right moment, and the right purpose. In front of her husband, she was the patient, understanding wife. In front of the neighbors, she was the polite young lady of the house. But deep inside, every time she saw Mama Kemi sitting quietly in that house, something sharp and restless stirred within her like a wound that never truly healed. To Ngozi, Mama Kemi's presence was not simply the presence of an elderly woman. It was a shadow of the past, of old values, of a quiet authority that Mama Kemi never tried to claim yet somehow carried naturally, an authority that made Ngozi feel judged every single day. Mama Kemi never raised her voice. She never caused a scene. She simply watched. Sometimes she sighed. Occasionally she offered a soft reminder about manners, gratitude, or respect within a family. And yet those words, light as smoke, somehow made Ngozi feel as though she were being exposed. That afternoon, the large mansion felt strangely suffocating. The light outside the windows had turned dull and gray, filtering through the thin curtains before settling across the polished tile floor like a layer of cold dust. The wall clock ticked with dry, steady beats. The ceiling fan hummed overhead, but it did nothing to ease the tension thickening in the air. Mama Kemi sat near the dining table, her back slightly bent, both hands folded quietly in her lap. Her silver hair was neatly tied behind her head. She was no longer young, yet there was a calmness about her that made anyone with shame in their heart feel smaller in her presence. And that was exactly what Ngozi hated most. Ngozi stood across from her, one hand pressed against the table while the other gripped her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Just moments earlier, she had realized that her husband knew about the money she had secretly been sending to her brother. She did not even need to ask who had told him. In this house, there was only one person who believed that truth mattered more than the appearance of peace. "I told you before," Ngozi said, her voice tight, each word sounding as though it had been trapped inside her for too long. "Never talk to my husband about my business." Mama Kemi lifted her eyes to look at her. Her gaze was tired, but it did not avoid Ngozi's. "My son deserves to know the truth." The words were not loud. They were not harsh. Yet they fell into the room like a spark landing in a barrel of oil that had long been left open. Ngozi straightened abruptly. For a moment, her face changed completely. the gentle mask she wore so well cracked, revealing the cold edge she usually kept hidden. Her breathing quickened, her chest rose and fell. Her eyes burned with anger mixed with the panic of someone who felt control slipping from her grasp. "The truth?" she repeated, letting out a dry laugh that sounded like a blade scraping against glass. "Who do you think you are, lecturing me every day with your so-called truth?" Mama Kemi remained silent. It was not the silence of surrender. It was the patience of someone who had lived through too many storms to argue with the anger of youth. Yet that silence felt like another accusation. Ngozi walked around the side of the table. Her heels struck the floor in short, sharp rhythms. She yanked the nearby chair aside, its legs scraping loudly against the tile with a chilling sound that felt like a warning. Mama Kemi flinched slightly. Her hands tightened on the edge of the chair, but she stayed seated. "Ever since you stepped into this house," Ngozi said, her voice trembling with anger, "everything has had to follow your rules. You look at me like I don't deserve to be your son's wife. You talk about morality as if you're the only person who knows what is right." "I never said you were unworthy," Mama Kemi replied calmly. "The way you live is what makes you uneasy." Those words struck exactly where Ngozi had been trying hardest to hide. For a moment, the air seemed to thicken around them. Ngozi froze, staring at her mother-in-law as if facing an enemy who had just spoken the name of her deepest fear. She was not only angry because she had been challenged. She was angry because Mama Kemi had seen the insecurity behind her carefully controlled appearance. "If you think you can ruin my life in this house," Ngozi said, her voice dropping dangerously low, "then today you'll learn who really decides things here." Mama Kemi slowly rose to her feet. Her movements were slow with age, yet there was something strangely steady in the way she stood. "Power without compassion," she said, looking directly at her daughter-in-law, "is nothing but emptiness wrapped in velvet." Ngozi clenched her teeth. The last restraint inside her snapped. She lunged forward and grabbed Mama Kemi's arm. The grip was far too strong for the fragile body of the old woman, and Mama Kemi stumbled, her shoulder bumping lightly into the table. A glass of water trembled on the surface, spilling onto the tablecloth. Mama Kemi tried to steady herself, gripping the chair with her other hand, but Ngozi did not let go. "Let go of me," Mama Kemi said. For the first time, her voice carried a trace of sharpness, the edge of dignity pushed too far. "You're still giving me orders?" Ngozi hissed, breathing hard, her beautiful face twisted with fury. "In this house, you have no authority anymore." Mama Kemi looked straight into her eyes, no pleading, no fear, only a sadness so deep that it made the other woman's anger seem even uglier. That look pushed Ngozi completely over the edge. She dragged Mama Kemi toward the dining table. The chair legs shifted and collided with a chaotic clatter. The tablecloth was pulled aside. A spoon fell to the floor and rolled away with a thin, metallic ringing sound. Mama Kemi breathed quickly, trying to pull Ngozi's hand away, but the strength of an elderly woman could not resist the rage blazing in front of her. In the fading light of evening, one woman fought to hold on to her dignity, while the other struggled to prove her power. They stood trapped in the middle of the room, like two people locked inside an invisible cage made of resentment, silence, and words that had never been spoken with kindness. Ngozi leaned close to her mother-in-law, her voice heavy and low. "I've endured you long enough." Outside, the sky over Lagos remained heavy and dark, as if a storm were hanging directly above the roof. Inside the luxurious mansion, what was building was no longer a simple argument. It was a collision between pride and control, between the dignity of old age and the violent stubbornness of a woman who refused to let anyone see her faults. And at that exact moment, when the chair was shoved once more, when anger had already crossed the boundary of words and stepped into action, the room suddenly fell into an eerie silence, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, as if the entire house knew that one more step would take everything past the point of no return. Ngozi could no longer hear anything except the rush of hot blood pounding in her ears. The large dining room, luxurious, polished, and elegant, suddenly felt suffocating, cold, like a sealed box trapping pure rage inside. The mahogany dining table, the expensive glassware, the thick cream-colored curtains swaying gently in the air from the conditioner, everything was still there, yet the atmosphere had changed. It had thickened, as if one could almost touch the heavy weight of hatred spreading through the house. Before Mama Kemi could even steady herself, Ngozi grabbed the silver hair at the back of her head. A choked cry escaped from the old woman's throat. Her frail body was yanked forward, her forehead nearly striking the wooden table. The chair behind her slid violently, its legs scraping across the tile with a harsh, piercing sound. The table shook. A few spoons clinked against the porcelain plate. A glass tilted and spilled water across the tablecloth. "You want to lecture me?" Ngozi hissed, her breath hot and ragged as if it had just come from a fire. Mama Kemi tried to grip the edge of the table to keep her balance. Her fingers trembled violently, the wrinkled skin stretched tight with fear and pain. Her already bent back curved even lower under the cruel grip of her daughter-in-law. She no longer had the strength to resist. She could only turn her head slightly, trying to escape the painful pull on her hair. "Please." Her voice broke, weak and hoarse. "Don't do this." But by then, the plea no longer reached Ngozi's ears. Instead, it made her feel something else, that she now held absolute power in that room. The very power she had long wanted to prove to the woman in front of her. Ngozi clenched her teeth. Her eyes no longer held the look of someone caught in a moment of anger. It was the gaze of bitterness that had been building for too long, finally finding its chance to spill out without restraint. She shoved Mama Kemi's head harder against the table. "You always think you're right," she said, each word grinding out through clenched teeth. "You always think you can stand above me just because you're his mother. Today I'll show you whose house this really is." Mama Kemi gasped for breath, her shoulders trembling, her cheek pressed against the cold wooden surface. Her silver hair had come loose, several strands falling free from the neat bun she always wore. That hair was not just a sign of old age. It was something she had preserved carefully, a final piece of her past, of the years she had shared with her late husband, of the life she had sacrificed to raise her son. But Ngozi saw none of those memories in it. She only saw something she could destroy. For a moment, she released Mama Kemi's hair, making the elderly woman think the storm had passed. But in the next second, Ngozi turned abruptly and strode toward the kitchen cabinet. She yanked the drawer open so hard it slammed against the rails with a loud bang. Inside were small, scattered items: scissors, kitchen tools, spare batteries, old charging cables, and an electric hair clipper that Adewale had once bought for the family barber who occasionally came to the house. Ngozi's hand touched it. That single motion seemed to drain the warmth from the room. Mama Kemi lifted her head slightly, her old eyes widening in terror. Before she could speak, Ngozi had already turned back, the clipper in her hand like a cruel sentence. "No," Mama Kemi whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ngozi, please." Ngozi pressed the button. The small motor came to life. At first it was only a soft buzzing sound, but in the tense silence of the room, it felt icy and sharp like metal scraping across bone. It wasn't loud, but it made the skin crawl, because anyone could understand what was about to happen. Mama Kemi trembled. Her eyes filled with tears. Her hands searched helplessly across the table as if looking for one last point of mercy. But there was nothing there except cold wood and the absolute indifference of the woman standing behind her. "My child," she said, her voice breaking apart. "This hair is the last thing I still keep from Adewale's father." For a moment, time seemed to slow, just one moment. Then it passed. Not long enough to awaken compassion in Ngozi. Even the mention of the man who had built this family with sweat and honor could not soften her heart. Her anger had already crossed the limits of ordinary conflict. It had become something darker, the need to humiliate. The need to see the person before her stripped of dignity so that she could feel taller. Ngozi pressed her hand onto her mother-in-law's shoulder, forcing her down again. Then she brought the clipper closer. The buzzing blade touched the silver hair. The first line cut through. Several white strands fell softly onto the table, then slid down onto the polished floor. They lay there fragile and silent, painful to look at, like years of sacrifice and patience being severed in seconds. A broken sob escaped Mama Kemi, not a scream, not a cry for help. Just a small, shattered sound, like the fragile heart of an old woman being crushed beneath the cruelty of youth. Ngozi continued, the second pass. Then the third. Clumps of silver hair fell to the floor in uneven patches, scattered across Mama Kemi's shoulders, the edge of the table, and beside the chair. Each time the blade passed, her body trembled like an old branch battered by a storm. Tears streamed down her face and onto the table, mixing with the water from the spilled glass, spreading into a cold, wet stain. The room held almost no other sound, only the relentless buzz of the clipper, only Ngozi's heavy breathing, only the muffled sobs the old woman tried desperately to hold back. If someone had walked in at that moment, they would never have believed that inside a luxurious mansion in a wealthy neighborhood, such a humiliating scene could exist, not between enemies on the street, but between people who lived under the same roof and called each other family. Ngozi stepped back half a pace to admire her work. Mama Kemi's neat silver bun was gone. The remaining hair was jagged and uneven, patches left exposed. On her wrinkled face was a pain that went far beyond physical suffering. It was the pain of being stripped of dignity, of being turned into punishment for another person's anger. Mama Kemi slowly lifted her trembling hand to touch her head. When her fingers felt the uneven, hacked hair, she froze. Her eyes closed halfway, and a single tear slid slowly down her cheek. In that moment, she no longer looked like a mother-in-law caught in an argument with her daughter-in-law. She looked like an elderly woman nearing the end of her life, someone who had believed she would finally find peace among her family, only to discover that old age is not always protected. Sometimes it becomes the moment when a person is most vulnerable to cruelty. Ngozi dropped the clipper onto the table with a sharp clatter. The dry sound seemed to wake the room from a short but violent nightmare. She looked at Mama Kemi with cold eyes. Yet deep inside them, a tiny flicker of unease had begun to appear, the kind that comes when someone realizes they have crossed a line that cannot be undone. But she still did not know the most important thing. On the bookshelf in the corner of the living room, connected to the dining area, hidden behind a decorative photo frame and a tall ivory ceramic vase, a small security camera was quietly watching. No one heard it, no one looked toward it, but it had recorded everything, from the first fistful of silver hair, from the screech of the chair across the floor, from Mama Kemi's desperate pleas, to every stroke of the clipper sending strands of hair drifting onto the floor like violated memories. The room would eventually be cleaned. The silver hair would be swept away. The table would be wiped dry. The clipper would be returned to the drawer as if it had never been used for such a purpose. But some things, once recorded, can never disappear. And sometimes a moment that seems like nothing more than an outburst of anger behind closed walls becomes the spark that brings down an entire life built on pride and deception. Anger often comes like fire flaring up violently, swallowing reason in a matter of minutes, then fading so quickly that a person can hardly believe what they have just done. But what it leaves behind does not disappear with the heat. It lingers in the air, on objects, in the eyes of the one who was hurt, and sometimes in a silence more terrifying than any accusation. In the end, the dining room became eerily still. Ngozi stood beside the table, breathing hard, loose strands of hair falling across her forehead, her chest still rising and falling from the storm of emotion that had not yet fully passed. In her hand, the hair clipper still vibrated faintly, as if carrying the aftershock of what had just happened. The smell of warm metal and the faint scent of freshly cut hair still hung in the air, circling like evidence that refused to disappear. Beneath the table, On the polished tile floor of the luxurious mansion, silver strands of hair lay scattered in small clusters. They were so light that even the air from the conditioner could make a few of them shift, yet the sight of them felt as heavy as lead. They were no longer just ordinary strands of hair. They looked like the last pieces of dignity torn from a frail human being and thrown to the floor. Ngozi looked at them. Just looked. And for one very brief moment, something uncertain flickered deep in her eyes. It was not quite regret. Perhaps it was only the discomfort of someone who had gone too far and suddenly realized she could never fully return to who she had been before. But the feeling passed almost instantly. Pride and bitterness had lived inside her too long to make room for compassion after a single moment of hesitation. She tightened her grip, then slammed the hair clipper down onto the table. The dry, sharp sound echoed through the empty room like a final period. "That is your lesson," she said. Her voice was no longer shrill with rage as it had been moments before. It was lower now, colder, and for that reason, even more frightening. It was the voice of someone trying to turn an act of cruelty into something justified, as if humiliating an old woman could somehow be called discipline. Mama Kemi still did not answer. She sat quietly by the edge of the table, her frail body leaning slightly to one side, as if one more shock might be enough to make her collapse. Her hands rested on her lap, trembling so badly that her fingertips curled in uneven rhythm. The silver hair that remained on her head was jagged and uneven, exposing parts of her scalp and making her look heartbreakingly fragile. But what made the sight so painful was not only the damage to her appearance, it was the silence. The silence of someone who had been hurt too deeply to speak. The silence of someone who understood that there are humiliations words cannot lighten, no matter how bitterly they are spoken. Slowly, Mama Kemi lifted a hand to the table, where the thin, cream-colored cloth had been pulled out of place during the struggle. Her wrinkled fingers closed around one corner of it. The movement was small, slow, as if her body itself had to relearn how to move after the shock of what had happened. Then she pulled the cloth upward and draped it over the uneven remains of her hair. The gesture was not merely to cover her head. It was like someone gathering the last fragments of her dignity. The cloth fell over her forehead and down the sides of her face, hiding the most visible marks of humiliation. But it could not hide her reddened eyes filled with tears. The corners of her eyes were swollen. Her eyelids trembled slightly. Even so, there was no fire in her gaze, no curse, no outburst of fury such as one might expect from someone pushed beyond endurance. There was only sadness. A deep, quiet sadness, so deep that anyone with even a trace of conscience would have felt diminished in its presence. She did not blame Ngozi, at least not aloud. Perhaps because at her age, after so many years of living, she understood a painful truth. The cruelest people do not stop when they are scolded. They stop only when the truth is held firmly before them. And at that moment, Mama Kemi no longer had the strength to fight back with words. What she chose to preserve in the end was not a scream, but the silence of her self-respect. Ngozi stood there for a few more seconds, as if waiting for some kind of reaction. Another plea, a louder cry, a display of weakness that would let her continue believing she had won. But Mama Kemi gave her none of that. That very silence changed the air in the room. It no longer felt like the aftermath of an argument. It felt like a place that had just witnessed something too wrong to be named with ordinary words. Ngozi looked away first. She stepped back from the dining table, her heels striking the floor with sharp, irritated clicks, though they were no longer as firm as before. Her shoulders stiffened. Her jaw tightened. The cold expression on her face was carefully maintained, like a mask she had to keep wearing to the very end, so that no one, not even herself, could see the crack opening inside her. As she passed the decorative mirror hanging near the entrance to the living room, her eyes brushed over her reflection. A young woman, elegantly dressed, standing inside an expensive house with a flawless outward appearance. But if someone looked for even half a second longer, they would see that something had shifted out of its usual order, not in her hair, not in her clothes, but in her eyes. The eyes of someone who had just done something unforgivable, yet was still trying to tell herself a different story so she could keep walking. Ngozi did not stop. She walked straight out of the room with an icy expression, leaving behind the chaos she herself had created only minutes earlier. The sound of her footsteps faded down the hallway, then disappeared into the deep quiet of the mansion. The entire house fell silent again, but it was not the normal silence of an afternoon in a wealthy neighborhood. It was a heavy silence, as though every wall, every door, every object in the house were keeping a secret too dark to bear. Mama Kemi remained where she was. She lowered her head beneath the cloth, and her shoulders trembled once, then again. Not loudly, just small tremors of pain forced into silence. She looked down at the floor, where her hair lay scattered around the chair legs. One strand had caught against the edge of her sandal. She did not pick it up. She only stared at it, as though looking at a piece of her life that had just been taken from her, without knowing whether to call it loss, humiliation, or the late awakening to the truth that old age is not always treated with kindness. Beyond the large glass doors, the evening light in Lagos was fading slowly. The sky grew grayer by the minute. The shadows of the trees outside stretched longer and fainter across the tiles. Everything seemed to be moving toward night, toward darkness, toward that time when people often believe whatever happens inside their homes will be hidden by the dark. But some eyes do not sleep. In the corner of the living room, where the light only partially reached the decorative bookshelf, a small camera was tucked so naturally into the scene that it almost disappeared. It had been placed carefully behind a silver photo frame and beside a tall ceramic vase, so small that no one would notice it unless they already knew it was there. From that angle, its lens looked down toward the dining area. Quietly, patiently, without a single warning sound, without a blinking light to draw attention. It had been there since before the argument began. It had seen Ngozi step forward. It had seen her hand seize the silver hair. It had seen the old mother forced down against the table. It had seen every pass of the clipper, every strand of hair falling, every tear shed in silence. And now it continued recording Mama Kemi sitting alone in the room like a forgotten figure among the invisible ruins of human cruelty. Not missing a single second. That camera knew no mercy, but it also knew no lies. It was not blinded by anger. It was not silenced by power. It was not deceived by the polished beauty of the mansion. It simply captured the truth whole, cold, exact, and cruel in its precision. In the human world, there are times when the powerful believe that shutting the door is enough to turn wrongdoing into a secret. They believe four walls will take their side. They believe the weaker person will remain silent forever. They believe tears can be wiped away, hair can be swept up, and traces can be erased before anyone else returns. But truth has its own way of surviving. Sometimes it lives in the memory of the victim. Sometimes it lives in the eyes of a witness. And sometimes it lives inside a small forgotten camera in the corner of a room. At last Mama Kemi moved. She placed her hands on the table and pushed herself up very slowly, very painfully, as though every muscle in her body had been drained by humiliation. She rose unsteadily, and the chair behind her shifted slightly. She pulled the cloth tighter over her head, then turned to look at the room one last time. Her eyes passed over the table, the spilled glass of water, the silver strands scattered across the floor. She did not see the camera. Ngozi had not seen it either. Only that room knew that what had just happened had not ended when the daughter-in-law walked out and the door closed behind her. On the contrary, that was the moment the truth had only just begun to take shape. Because the moment an act of cruelty is recorded, it is no longer just a passing burst of anger. It becomes evidence. And evidence, once it exists, is often far more patient than human beings. 3 days later, Adewale's mansion was glowing with light, as if nothing dark had ever passed through it. The long dining table had been arranged with care. Crystal glasses caught the warm golden light. White porcelain plates were neatly set in place. The aroma of food drifted softly through the air. Greetings, chairs shifting, and the polite laughter of relatives blended together into the familiar sound of a family evening that seemed peaceful, refined, and full of proper manners. Ngozi appeared in a soft pearl-colored dress, her makeup flawless, her smile measured, her voice just gentle enough. She moved among the guests like the model hostess pouring wine, asking after everyone, inviting them to enjoy the appetizers. No one looking at her then would have imagined that only a few days earlier, those very same hands had caused a humiliation no words could ever justify. And that is often the most terrifying thing about family tragedies. Sometimes, the person who commits the cruelest act is the one who knows best how to look perfect in front of others. Mama Kemi sat in a chair near the corner of the living room, quiet as a small shadow amid all the comfort and elegance around her. Her head was fully covered with a scarf. She hardly spoke, only nodding faintly in response to a few greetings. Some relatives assumed she was tired. Others thought old age had simply made her more withdrawn. No one knew that beneath that scarf was the wound of a dignity that had been trampled. No one knew that her silence was not weakness or fatigue, but the kind of pain that, once it goes deep enough, leaves a person with no strength to tell it aloud. Adewale returned from his business trip calmer than usual. He greeted each person, shook hands, thanked them for coming to dinner. He was still the composed man the family had always known. A low, steady voice, a firm gaze, a man who spoke little and never flaunted his power, even though everyone understood that he carried the weight of the family's fortune on his shoulders. But that night, there was something different about him. Not obvious anger, not dramatic coldness. It was restraint sharp as steel. He sat down, listened to a few casual stories, lightly raised his glass to an uncle, then quietly looked around the room as if confirming that everyone who needed to be there was already present. Ngozi was still playing her role perfectly. She leaned down to refill wine for one of the older women, smiled as an uncle told an old family story, then glanced toward her husband with that familiar tender expression of a well-mannered wife. Perhaps in that very moment, she believed it was all over. Hair could be cut, tears could be swallowed. Humiliation could be hidden beneath a scarf, a few days of silence, and the perfect lipstick of an evening reception. Many people live that way. They do not truly believe they are innocent. They simply believe that if the truth has not yet been exposed, then it can still be buried. When the final dish had just been placed on the table, Adewale slowly stood up. The room quieted almost instantly. Small conversations came to a stop. Several people turned fully toward him. Ngozi looked up as well, her smile still in place, though a flicker of caution had already appeared in her eyes. Adewale set his wineglass down on the table. "Before we have dinner," he said, his voice very calm, "I want everyone to see something." The atmosphere changed at once. No one understood what was happening, but the calm in his tone did not carry the usual social warmth of a dinner blessing or casual announcement. It felt more like the silence in a courtroom just before evidence is presented. A few people exchanged glances. One uncle frowned. Ngozi stood still, one hand still resting on the neck of a wine bottle, the smile beginning to stiffen at the corners of her mouth. Adewale walked to the low cabinet against the wall and picked up a remote control. The large screen at the front of the living room came to life. For the first few seconds, only a pale blue glow washed across everyone's faces. No one spoke. The only sounds were the steady hum of the air conditioner and the soft clink of glass as someone set a drink down on a coaster. Then the video began to play. The image on the screen showed the familiar living room of that very house. The camera angle was slightly elevated, quiet, cold, and clear with ruthless precision. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Just the room in daylight, silent, with the dining table, the bookshelf, the hallway, everything in its place, just as it had been on countless other afternoons. Then Mama Kemi appeared on the screen. She sat down in the chair beside the table, her back slightly bent, her hands resting on her lap, her silver hair neatly tied behind her head. That image made the real room even quieter. A few people turned to look at Mama Kemi, sitting in the corner, as if comparing the woman before them with the figure on the screen. She lowered her head very slightly. Her hand tightened around the edge of her scarf. Then Ngozi walked into frame. A strange feeling moved through the room. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt the air shift. Because in real footage, there's always something words cannot hide, the true nature of a moment. The Ngozi on that screen was not the Ngozi standing among them now. There was no soft smile, no gentle voice. Only hurried steps, stiff shoulders, and anger revealed in every movement. Adewale did not say a single word. He stood beside the screen, his arms at his sides, his face almost expressionless. The video continued. Everyone saw Ngozi move toward Mama Kemi. They saw her say something. Not everyone could hear every word clearly through the speakers, but it was enough to catch the sharpness in her tone, the bitterness in it. They saw Mama Kemi look up. They saw the atmosphere inside the recording change in only a few seconds. Then they saw Ngozi's hand reach out. A quiet gasp sounded somewhere in the room, perhaps from an aunt, perhaps from someone who could not believe what they were seeing. On the screen, Ngozi grabbed Mama Kemi's silver hair. In the real room, a wine glass paused in midair in one uncle's hand. No one moved. The video showed no mercy to anyone. It did not cut away. It did not soften the details. It simply carried the truth forward to where it had always been headed. They watched Mama Kemi being forced down against the table. The chair shifted. The frail body struggled. Then Ngozi opened the drawer and took out the electric hair clipper. The moment the small motor buzzed through the screen speakers, the entire room seemed to freeze. The sound was not loud, but it cut through every layer of politeness, every pretense, every polished surface of that elegant family dinner. It was cold as a blade slicing through the last curtain still shielding the truth. One of the older women in the family immediately lifted her hand to her mouth. Her eyes widened so far that she seemed unable to believe what was unfolding before her. On the screen, Ngozi forced Mama Kemi's head down onto the table and began shaving away her silver hair. There were no heavy breaths now. No shifting chairs, no clinking glasses. Only the steady buzz of the clipper from the large screen and the image of an elderly mother trembling under her daughter-in-law's hand. That image carried the force of a direct blow to conscience. It was not only cruelty, it was deliberate humiliation. It was the moment one human being used her power inside a closed house to trample the dignity of someone weaker and then believed it would disappear into silence. Ngozi stood frozen. The color seemed to drain from her face in an instant. Her eyes were wide and unblinking. The lips that had been curved into a graceful smile moments before now hung slightly open, stiff, like someone whose costume had just been ripped away in the middle of a brightly lit stage. She looked at the screen, then at the faces around her, then back at the screen again, as if her mind refused to accept that her secret was no longer trapped inside four silent walls. The wine glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. The sound of breaking glass made a few people flinch, but no one looked down. Red wine spread across the tiles like an open wound, but in that moment, no one cared about the spill at their feet. Every eye was fixed on the screen, where the truth was speaking for itself. One uncle shot to his feet. An aunt shook her head and stepped back half a pace, as though she could not bear to believe that the woman who had just poured her wine minutes earlier could be the same woman in the footage. Some looked at Mama Kemi with late and painful sorrow. Others looked at Adewale, waiting for him to shout, to explode, to smash something. But he did none of those things. Adewale's calmness in that moment was more terrifying than anger. He stood straight, watching the video until its final second, as if forcing everyone in that room to see it all the way through, to witness it fully, to understand that there are some things that, if merely told, still leave room for doubt, excuses, and uncertainty. But once seen with one's own eyes, there is no retreat. The video ended. The screen froze on a still frame, Mama Kemi sitting quietly with a scarf over her head, while the corner of the room remained chillingly still. That image stayed on the screen for only a few seconds, yet it felt like an entire sentence being pronounced. No one spoke. The whole room fell silent in the truest sense of the word. That silence was not only shock. It was the moment an entire family realized that inside the very house they had entered with smiles, blessings, and admiration for its polished beauty, there had long existed a darkness none of them had chosen to see until it was dragged into the light. Ngozi took a small step back, then half a step more. But there was nowhere in that room far enough for her to escape the eyes fixed on her. No beautiful dress could save her now. No soft voice could save her now. No performance of the perfect wife could save her now. Because from the moment that video began to play, she was no longer facing an accusation, she was facing evidence. And evidence, when it speaks in images, rarely leaves the guilty even the smallest place to hide. The video ended. The large screen in the living room froze on the final frame, a brightly lit room, the dining table still standing where it had always been, and an elderly mother sitting quietly with a scarf over her head, as if trying to protect the last fragments of her dignity. The image itself was still, yet its weight continued to press down on everyone in the mansion, like an invisible stone dropped into the center of their chests. No one said a word. No one dared. The sound of the wine glass shattering moments earlier had long faded. The red wine still spread across the floor at Ngozi's feet, reflecting the warm yellow light like an open wound that had not closed. But in that moment, no one was looking at the floor anymore. Every eye was fixed on the space between the truth that had just been exposed and the shockwave it had left behind. An older aunt raised a hand to her chest, as though her heart could not keep pace with what she had just seen. The uncle at the head of the table lowered his head, his jaw clenched tight, his face flushed with restrained anger. A younger cousin stared at Ngozi in open horror, as if the woman standing before them was no longer the same person who had been pouring wine, smiling, and greeting guests only minutes earlier, but someone entirely different who had stepped out from behind her own mask. And Ngozi stood frozen. She no longer carried the soft grace of the perfect hostess. Her shoulders were rigid. Her hands hung at her sides, her fingertips trembling faintly. Her lips moved slightly, as if searching for something to say, a denial, an explanation, some kind of escape from the collapse happening right in front of her. But no sound came out. Because she understood what every other person in that room understood. There are moments when the truth is so clear that words no longer matter. Adwale was still standing beside the screen. From beginning to end, he had not smashed anything, shouted, or erupted like a man publicly humiliated before his family. But it was his silence that frightened the room the most. It was not the silence of weakness. It was the silence of someone who had already crossed through the first shock, passed through the pain, and arrived at the coldest place of decision. He drew a slow breath. Then he began to walk. Not quickly, not urgently, not with a single wasted movement. Adwale stepped away from the screen and walked straight toward the corner of the room where his mother was sitting. Each footstep landed softly on the tile, but in the thick, breathless air, it sounded as clear as fate approaching. Mama Kemi remained seated. The pale scarf still covered the jagged remains of her hair. Her hands rested on her lap, her old fingers tightly intertwined. Since the video began, she had barely lifted her head. Perhaps she was too tired. Perhaps she did not want to see the late sympathy in the eyes of people who were only learning the truth today. Or perhaps, after everything that had happened, the heart of an old mother had only enough strength left to sit still and wait to see where the truth would go. Adwale stopped in front of her. For a few seconds, he simply stood there looking at his mother. His eyes moved over the scarf covering her head, over her thin shoulders, over the face marked by age and endurance. The woman who had raised him, who had lived through poverty, loss, and countless seasons of hardship to give her son the life he had now, was sitting folded into herself like someone seeking shelter in the very house her son owned. That pain showed in Adwale's eyes like a deep cut that made no sound. Then he knelt down. A quiet ripple moved through the room at that gesture, A successful man, respected by the entire family, a man who always carried himself with straight-backed control, was now kneeling before his elderly mother in the middle of the room where the truth had just been exposed, not to perform, not to impress anyone, but as though only by lowering himself could he come close enough to her pain to say what he needed to say. "Mother." His voice dropped low, turning rough at the end of the word, as though something deep in his chest had caught there. "I'm sorry I wasn't here to protect you." No one in the room moved. The sentence was not long, it was not ornate, but it made the air tremble in a way completely different from the video that had just played. If the video was proof of cruelty, then these words were proof of love arriving too late, and still meaning everything. It was the painful confession of a son realizing that all his success meant nothing if his mother could be humiliated in his absence. Mama Kemi slowly lifted her head. Beneath the thin scarf, her eyes were red and swollen, as if she had cried more than anyone in the room had seen. She looked at her son, and there was no accusation in her gaze, only deep sadness and the heartbreaking gentleness of a mother who, even while wounded, still does not want to wound her child. Her trembling hand rose and touched his face. Just a small gesture, but it was enough to make a few people in the room turn away and wipe their eyes. Adwail gently placed his hand over his mother's, holding it for a second as though holding on to an unspoken promise. Then he stood, and in that instant, the entire room seemed to change color. The man who had just knelt before his mother now rose slowly to his full height, turned around, and fixed his eyes on Ngozi. That was no longer the look of a husband, nor was it the look of a man trying to preserve the dignity of the family. It was the look of someone who had finally seen what could no longer be overlooked and understood that one more silence would be the same as complicity. Ngozi took half a step back. She was about to say something. It showed plainly on her face. Her throat moved, her lips parted. Perhaps she wanted to say she had not meant it. Perhaps she wanted to say it was only a moment of anger. Perhaps she wanted to grab hold of any scrap of excuse left so she would not be swallowed whole by what she had done. But no words were strong enough to stand against a video. No excuse was clean enough to erase the humiliation she had inflicted. No tears were convincing enough once the truth had been laid bare in every second, every frame, every merciless pass of the clipper. "From this day forward," Adwail said. His voice was low, calm, and so cold that each word seemed to be laid down in iron. "This house will have no room for cruelty." The sentence rang out, not loudly, not harshly, but it reached every corner of the room like a verdict being delivered. No one mistook it for a burst of temporary anger. Everyone knew it was a decision born from evidence, from pain, and from the total collapse of trust. Ngozi trembled. For the first time that entire evening, the shell of cold composure around her truly cracked. Her face drained of color. One hand lifted, as though trying to reach for something to hold onto the edge of the table. The back of a chair, empty air, anything that might keep her standing in a moment, slipping beyond her control. But all around her now, there were only eyes. Not a single one remained on her side. Not a single voice stood ready to defend her. The relatives who had smiled at her, praised her grace, believed she was a worthy wife for Adwail, were now looking at her as if they were seeing for the first time the real nature hidden beneath elegance and politeness. And the cruelest thing for a person who lives by appearances is not to be shouted at. It is the moment everyone stops believing. One aunt slowly rose from her chair, walked to Mama Kemi, and adjusted the scarf on her head with a belated gesture of protection. An uncle stepped aside, choosing not to stand near Ngozi anymore, as if even physical distance needed to be redefined. The atmosphere in the room was no longer that of a family dinner. It had become a place where the line between right and wrong had finally been drawn clearly, so clearly that no one could pretend not to see it anymore. Outside the window, the wind began to rise. At first it was only a soft current passing through the palm trees in the yard. Then it grew stronger. The fronds brushed against one another with a low rustling sound, like the whisper of the night sky when something hidden too long is finally dragged into the light. The curtains near the glass doors stirred gently. The sky outside looked darker, deeper, as if the storm held back for days had finally decided to move. That scene gave many people a strange feeling, as if even nature itself were bearing witness. Adwale did not shout any further, did not make a long speech, did not need to explain the event again for anyone to understand. He simply walked to the table, picked up the remote, and turned off the screen. The room returned to the familiar yellow light of the lamps, but no one felt it as warm as before. Because from the moment that truth appeared, this was no longer the same room. It had become a place where memory and justice had touched each other. He turned back and stood beside his mother. One hand came to rest gently on Mama Kemi's shoulder. The gesture was simple, but certain, like the final boundary finally being raised after far too much delay. It said everything he did not yet need to speak aloud, that from this moment on, his mother would no longer be alone in this house. That what had happened would not be cleaned away like broken glass and spilled wine. That the silence that had once sheltered the wrongdoer had come to an end. Ngozi was still standing there, alone in a crowded room. She wanted to say something. Everyone could see that. But no words would stand beside her. They caught in her throat and died before reaching sound, because even she knew that some actions cross a line language cannot save. An apology may reach a mistake, but it cannot instantly repair dignity that was torn apart by deliberate cruelty. The mansion was still brightly lit, the dinner table was still set, the glasses and dishes were still neatly arranged. But no one was thinking about eating anymore, because in those few short minutes, the whole family had witnessed something more important than ritual, appearance, or polished manners. They had seen truth rise in its own form, unadorned, unexcused, and bowing to no splendor. And in that room, while the wind continued to move through the palms outside the window, everyone understood something life has always repeated in its harshest way. The truth may be delayed, it may be covered. It may be buried by the powerful beneath silence, money, authority, or fear. But it does not die, it waits. It is patient. And one day, it appears at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place, so clearly that no one can look away. That is why justice does not always arrive with a gavel, nor with grand speeches or dramatic declarations. Sometimes it arrives in the moment a son kneels before his mother, then rises to draw the final line between family and cruelty. That night, no one left with the same feeling they had brought in. And no one in that house doubted this anymore. When people dare to do evil in the dark, they often imagine the darkness as their ally. But it is in the deepest part of night that truth begins to open its eyes.